Hello and welcome to the SIG API Machinery biweekly meeting for Wednesday, August 29. We do not have much of an agenda yet this week unless some items have been added. Oh, it looks like a couple have. That's good. We will jump straight into those. Some of the Googlers aren't here today, so I am filling in. We could, Pete Barker, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So we've had this dynamic audit API up for a while. We've iterated on it a number of times. I think we've gotten to place stability. I'm just seeing if we can, potentially hash out these remaining issues before we hit freeze here. I didn't know if anyone had comments on it or if there's any advice on how we could, still get this going before freeze. It seems to have kind of hit a block here somehow. So just trying to discuss, I guess.
Freeze is next week, Tuesday, right?
Yeah, freeze is Tuesday. Yep.
Okay, that's coming up quick.
Yeah.
What are the main blockers?
So we changed the API a couple times. We originally put it in the API server, then we moved it out because of issues with legacy scheme. We've changed around a couple things. The most recent was we had to copy out the policy object that was originally in the API server, and we had to put it into basically k8io./API. In doing so, there was maybe some changes wanted. I know Lava Lamp was wanting some changes there. That is tracking with the internal APIs. So there was just, I guess, a disagreement on whether we should be making changes with this type going in where we're just trying to expose over REST that's already an existing implementation, or I guess just looking for advice on a way forward there. I don't know what the answer is exactly.
So I would say that my default position at this point would be we're in slush. We're going to try to avoid adding something like an entire new API. The only exception I know of would be the custom resource versioning webhook, but that's been under review for some time, and the design started and was more or less agreed to, back before we started. I can see comments in the linked poll here that are actually even questioning whether this should be a custom resource or not. Could you actually start with that out of tree to start? And that would let you move forward during the freeze time. And you would have something more concrete when 1.13 opens.
So I guess the issue is, we had a cap for this. We did the whole cap. We evangelized that out. We got a bunch of reviews on it. It got accepted in its current state. That was very clearly targeted for 1.12. And now there's been a slush of changes after that. So, the whole design process has gone back months and months at this point.
Yeah. Just to weigh in on a couple things there. Design process taking months and months is not unusual. And when this originally started, it was kind of proposed to be phased in as a let's register webhooks alone, but not policy. And then kind of towards the end of feature freeze, expanding it to policy was tried to be added in. And the feedback at that point was that this is pretty aggressive for 1.12 to try to bite off all of that. And so I think a good attempt has been made, but I think it's not surprising that such a large effort didn't fit in just a few weeks. Also, to the point about in tree, out of tree, the agreement to work towards being able to register webhooks with dynamic policy for dynamic audit doesn't preclude an initial stage of that development happening out of tree. So I think Tim's kind of clarification comment was probably accurate. This is still a direction that we want to see, but that doesn't mean we can't make the first phase of it be done using out-of-tree methods.
Yeah, I definitely understand that. And how we started with that, I think that would have been fine.
And also, like Tim said, some of this has been evolving this release, right? Like we're kind of reaching a point where bandwidth-wise, trying not to block people, trying to allow experimentation without destabilizing or bloating the core repos, is pushing more and more things to be built that way. Even things that this release were being proposed as kind of in-tree resources. So I apologize for the extent to which you've been kind of on the receiving end of some of the churn around how we're hoping these things can be built.
Well, I mean, it's certainly a lot of time, you know, like I've spent a good, I don't know, month and a half, like just straight working on this feature. And, you know, it's tested, it's working. I have it running in a cluster, everything's good. I sort of now, you know, last minute kind of pulled back on something that's working. It's feature gated. It's an alpha feature. We've followed all the steps to get it in. It just seems like you know, feels like I'm getting kicked in the teeth a little bit. So it just feels like there's something wrong then with the process of the CAP and going forward there, because it's certainly a lot of time that, you know, Heptio has invested into this feature that we're now going to lose. I guess maybe not lose entirely, but it's, you know, it's just, I guess it's just frustrating, you know.
Yeah, like I said, I'm definitely sympathetic to that. I think some of those kind of timeframes or expectations around how long it takes to get something like this in, you're in good company, which isn't comforting when you're in that position. But it's not uncommon for things that especially go into like the API server level, not even the Kube API server, but things that we want to become part of every API server to take a long time. And that's one of the reasons we are looking to prototyping things out of tree, getting an alpha version or two under belts, and getting experience, like practical experience with APIs, so that we can actually understand if this approach works and unblock you, right? So that instead of spending weeks or months trying to build it into the API server and us trying to figure out if this is going to work before we let it in tree, we can iterate and get experience without committing the core repo to it.
Yeah, I hope you don't take this as we don't want the feature, right? I
I'm
find
not
the feature
saying that way,
compelling.
you know,
Yeah.
It's just kind of frustrating. I mean, I can definitely see the CRD for like the API objects. I think that makes sense. But as far as the entry work around the implementation, it seems like that'd be pretty hard to get, you know, valuable feedback, having that somehow out of tree outside the API server and not worked into the pipeline there. So I guess I don't know where that leaves us on that piece.
Well, like Tim's suggestion about the API servers today can start up pointing at sending audit events to a webhook, right? And if you had an implementation of that webhook, that would pay attention to these dynamic distribution objects. And like the implementation you already have is basically what or similar to what would be needed to kind of send events of different levels to different webhooks. Either way, one of the things we've been talking about recently in SIG architecture is how do we get feedback on alpha features? And today, if you turn on alpha features in your API server or in any of your components, you're unsupported. We don't support upgrading those. We don't If you report bugs, like we want to know the bugs, but we're not going to backport them to old versions, things like that. So figuring out how we actually gain experience with alpha features. So if you have an out of tree alpha feature, then deploying it to your cluster consists of like set up the CRD and start your API server pointing at a webhook audit sync and sending all events to it. And that's a pretty, I guess, relatively lightweight way to start trying out a feature like this. Just from a consumer perspective, they don't have to wait for Kubernetes 1.12 or even 1.11, right? Like any of the versions that can send audit events to a webhook could try out this feature.
Yeah, I mean, I get that, and we're basically doing that internally today, and we've been doing that for a little while. I guess the point was to try and actually get the code, at least the implementation piece into the API server, where we could, begin testing it on that route. I mean, it is totally feature gated. I guess Joe's point here, talking with him earlier, was that we've got it completely feature gated. So the point is to get it in the customer's hands so we can begin iterating on that piece and actually getting feedback. We'd already kind of started planning out a roadmap to get feedback on the alpha feature from our customers. We can't do that without it, actually implemented. So, I mean, as far as having something that's kind of CRD-ish, we don't have it as a CRD today, but I could do that in a day or two. But we have this basic implementation of filtering out events going to sinks. We have that working in a number of environments today. It's just, I don't know how we then get from there to, a beta feature, or if that's even possible.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch the last thing you said.
So, I mean, if we keep this out of tree, is there a way to go from out of tree CRD straight to beta, or does it have to go out of tree CRD to in-tree alpha and then beta? I mean, or is that just not defined today?
A path from CRD to in-tree native types is not defined today. There are opinions on both sides about whether things like this, that from a client perspective, wouldn't know that it's a CRD, but on the server side would be implemented as a CRD. Like I said, there's opinions on both sides for that. But at least kind of new alpha level features are being asked to prototype and prove out the APIs and the uses that way.
So, I mean, what should I do with...
So, Jordan, if we had...
Oh, sorry.
Hang on a second. Yeah, so if we had this to do over again, like we had the CAP, and it had a proposed API and some proposed changes to the API server implementation, it sounds like the do-over would have been, okay, maybe we do a CAP, okay, but we prove it out with CRDs with no modifications to core, get various SIGs input and buy-in and feedback, and then get some sort of blessing to go modify entry to, like whether it's using CRDs or not, at least modify the entry bits to put this logic in place for filtering or whatever it happens to be. Is that accurate?
I think that is what is being asked for. It's the problem is we basically have tons and tons of things that are like half-started alpha level efforts that never progress and never get, we just don't have confidence in use cases. And so things sit in alpha for a number of releases. And then it's like, well, it's time to promote it. And there's not really good evidence that they work and are solving problems and scale. And like, and so being able to point to like, here is this thing that and in a lot of different scenarios using it, and they haven't poked obvious holes in the API. Being able to do that is easier with things that are built as add-ons.
I agree, but I have two concerns. One is if you have to make a change to the API server to make something work, like let's say that audit didn't exist, and then we wanted to add it to the API server. That obviously whatever it is, audit, whatever, couldn't be done externally, most likely.
Sure. So things for which there is no extension point at all, like that's a different category of thing. But
Okay.
audit is not in that bucket, right?
Yeah,
like there is a way to delegate out to an external thing.
Right. So that's one concern, which doesn't apply here. The second concern is just getting eyes from this SIG and other SIGs and people in the community. If you go about doing something out of tree, which like I'm all in favor in like generally speaking doing things out of tree if you can, but like getting the appropriate thought time from members of this SIG and the community to actually review it would be a concern.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've seen the like the API review pipeline stuff that's been going on. The problem is this stuff is so cross-cutting, and there's like a kind of small pool of people that it bottlenecks through. And so trying to, at the very least, get visibility to that pipeline is something we've been working on. And so like from your perspective, Patrick, you work on this, and this is the most important thing in your world. And it's like, I've been working on this and talking to people for 2 months. Like, how could this not be at the front of the line? And you don't see like the API reviews that have literally been like in progress for 2 releases or 3 releases. And it's the fact that we don't have that visibility is a problem. And so trying to give people who are waiting for reviews visibility is what we're doing. And then also balancing out reviews so that like one person isn't blocking 8 things and other people only have 1 thing on their plate. So things that involve API changes are getting scheduled and then assigned, and people can see like where am I in this process? What can I expect as far as like a time frame for feedback? And Andy, to your point, there are 2 kind of types of reviews we're looking to do. One is things that we're going to ship have a pretty high bar, but then there's also like advisory reviews. So if someone's doing something out of tree, but it's sponsored by a SIG or something, and they're going to do it as a CRD, but they want kind of eyes on the API to say like, is this obviously problematic? Advisory reviews are a category of thing that we're wanting to be able to be involved in as well. And so part of that effort is to get visibility on the pipeline. Part of it is to make it possible to engage with API review in a couple different ways. And then a third part is to let people who want to grow into API reviewer approvers participate as well. And so when things waiting for API feedback are more visible, people who want to get involved can jump in and take passes over it and make suggestions, make observations, and the API approver pool can kind of give final sign-off, but then also help mentor the people who are jumping in doing kind of provisional reviews and say, oh, well, this person has given feedback on these 10 different APIs. They did a really good job. They're spotting things and like catching things. And so this is our effort to help grow that pool and give us more bandwidth for that type of thing. And so I agree that the current approach has some problems, visibility, capacity. I totally agree. And so those are some of the things we are trying to do right now to fix that, and they're just getting started. And like I said, I'm sorry that you are in the leading wave of people whose problems were what are pushing us to do these things.
I mean, I definitely appreciate you guys doing that. I'm just wondering with this use case, I mean, how much sense it makes for me to build out a proxy that's just filtering events. I mean, which I already basically have. I just don't feel like it really proves anything. I mean, just filtering events was like one little piece of code in this whole, big PR. And to do that is, it's really just one test to know that you're doing that properly. I just don't know how much could really be gained in this scenario from doing it with a CRD. I can definitely see a lot of other scenarios where that makes sense. I just, in this particular case, I'm not sure I see it. Yeah.
So for the specific feedback that Daniel had on the API, I actually saw his comments come in, but I hadn't had time to go look at them. I know he was kind of asking questions about things that are currently the file-based config, and Tim was answering some of those, but neither of them are on the call actually. So I think Daniel was looking for more consistency with some other, like the webhook related thing, or the admission webhook config. But if the audit use cases are working and make sense, then I think that would probably be okay to leave as it is. Like I said, for 112, I think it was aggressive to get all of it in, and I don't know that. I mean, this weekend's a holiday weekend. Like, the runway's super short, and I think it's probably unlikely for 112. If we want to solicit feedback about whether this would be asked to be done out of tree, even in a later release, we could find that out. Like Tim said, I think there are some big voices in SIG Arch that are asking basically everything to be done that way, if at all possible. And so I don't know if that is the guidance, if you would want to go ahead and start looking at that, or if you'd want to wait and try to get something in the present form in 113.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to know. I just don't know how much we're going to gain from doing a CRD. It just seems like it'd almost be a wasted cycle to me. So yeah, I don't know. I guess I need approval on that from someone then to go on a tree at this point.
To do what?
To go in tree. Sorry.
Yeah, basically big API surface things coming in tree raise eyebrows, and the question is always, can we do this without bringing it in tree? Just because big API surfaces take a lot to support, and sometimes the answer is no, and that's okay. But I think it's a reasonable thing to investigate and ask first. Instead of just assuming, oh, well, entry is easy, because then I don't have to think about like how people set this up.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering where the voices were for that in the CAP process. That, I mean, that was, it was just highly, highly evangelized. It was CAP of the week. It was brought, to this SIG, to SIG Auth a bunch of times, and that never came up once. So it seems like a lot of wasted effort around that. So,
as far as like the API and the capability, I don't think that. I think the goal is that to the people who are using this and to the people who are making use of the function, they don't really care how the implementation is done. Like, this is a capability that I think is important, and a method of interacting. I want to register a webhook and describe the types of audit events I get for it. Like, those are the things that I think were the parts of the KEP that needed the most feedback and most evangelism. Like, is this a use case that people care about? And so, like, you don't want to completely hand wave over implementation details, but the agreement about this is a valuable thing for the SIGs to pursue was, I think, more about the capability and the feature set. And to some extent, even the APIs, discussion of the APIs is fine, whether they're native or CRD, to a client, they should not care.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that, but we do have the implementation details section, and that was laid out pretty clearly. It's just not called out at all, and it was a substantial amount of time trying to build an API in there. I mean, it's obviously not the first one I did, so I don't want to learn.
Tim and I were the ones primarily looking at it, and we are not the strong voices in favor of doing things as CRDs, even things the API server depends on.
That makes
And
a lot
so
of sense. Okay.
that's why you didn't get that feedback from us.
Okay. It makes a little more sense. Yeah. Okay. 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 I guess I'm not sure how to go forward. Is this something we need to talk with SIG Arch about?
Probably so. I think this is a good example of an API or a feature that, on the one hand, you could do via CRDs. Like, it's slow moving. You know, it's not a high traffic API. It's like basically a config API that's pretty slow moving. But on the other hand, you have the API server itself using it and depending on it, and like how, if you wanted to build the sending piece in tree and have it and implement the API as a CRD, like that's kind of the direction SIG Arch has been asking the kubelet to go with some things. And I think there are some weird questions around how that actually works. You kind of have a binary built to run based on APIs that aren't shipped as part of the binary. I think
that part seems really odd to me, that you would have to separately install them. Seems strange, but
so I think this is a good example to kind of bring to SIG Arch and say, what should this look like if you want us to build this API out of tree? Like, how does it get deployed? How does the API server depend on it? Like I said, there's some disagreement there, and so bringing specific use cases, like how should this work if you want us to work this way, are good questions to ask. And again, I'm sorry you have to be involved in asking them.
Yeah. But I guess this almost needs to get evangelized further across the SIGs too, because I mean the reviews on the API started weeks back, almost 3 weeks back, and that it also wasn't mentioned there with anyone that looked over it. So I guess it's just disagreement on how to do things. But it seems like that's
I think some of it is bandwidth. Just because someone saw part of it doesn't mean that everyone sat down and kind of thought all the way through it. Some of it is kind of settling on this new proposed way of working and reasoning through the implications on all the things that are in progress. And some of it is kind of individuals. Some individuals are hitting that direction stronger than others, and depending on who is looking at it, you will get that feedback more strongly. And so again, these are things that need to be figured out and made consistent and made clear and kind of applied consistently to keps and polls, and so feedback from you to SIG Arch about this experience and kind of requests for specific guidance would be a good next step. I'd recommend that.
Cool. We'll start there. Thanks, Jordan.
All right. Thanks, everybody. It looks like that was our only agenda item. Does anybody have anything else they would like to bring up? All right. Thank you, everybody. We will meet again in 2 weeks.